The Brutalist is one of the biggest awards contenders of the year and has been praised by death by literally everybody that has seen it. So naturally, I was unbelievably excited to check this one out, but that's been extremely difficult to do because A24's distribution is just abysmal, so bad. But I finally saw it and it's epic. Now I'm gonna say this straight off the bat. I don't think this is a masterpiece or one of the greatest films that's ever been distributed by A24, but I don't have to think all of that. I don't have to think that it's the god in the form of film to think it's fantastic. This thing feels monumental. It feels huge. It feels like we're watching something that's going to be talked about for generations to come. It feels like a sweeping historical epic, and it reminds me a lot of like other 3 hour plus historical dramas from this decade. The most notable ones coming to mind being the incredible Killers of the Flower Moon and the masterpiece that is Oppenheimer. I didn't feel a single second of this film. It utilizes its runtime so well, and it all feels earned. This runtime feels earned. Every second adds something to the story, whether it be giving its audience more of an emotional connection to the protagonist Laszlo Toth, or telling a joke, because this movie was actually way funnier than I ever would have expected. It's not a comedy, actually. It's not even in the conversation of being a comedy, but it's funny. Like, the jokes that are in this film are funny. Every single performer in this film delivers some of the best performances of the year. Adrian Brody is as outstanding as expected, further solidifying the fact that he's one of the best actors working today. Felicity Jones is equally as phenomenal. She's always been underrated, but yeah, she's fantastic in this film. But the one that really stole the show for me and for a lot of people is the incredible Guy Pearce. His character Harrison can be charismatic, he can be welcoming, he can be funny, but he can also be just a complete asshole, a complete jerk, and unbelievably unlikable, especially towards the end of the film. I'm not the biggest fan of the ambiguous ending that the character gets, but we'll get to that in just a moment. Visually, this thing is a feast. The cinematography is phenomenal. So many creative and uniquely executed shots in this film that will stick with me for like years to come. Admittedly, I was quite unfamiliar with Brady Corbet's filmography before this film was announced, but the direction here, absolutely outstanding. He asks the audience the same question all throughout the film: to what length would you go to preserve your art? And by the end, he leaves it up for interpretation, which I find super fascinating. It's a nearly 4 hour film with a 15-minute intermission dividing the film into two parts, and he never answers the main question. There's so many creative choices in this film that I find admirable, regardless of whether I'm fully on board or not. Now, moving on to my negatives, which what I wasn't on board with was how abrupt and kind of rushed the ending felt. I've mentioned this film's runtime like so many times already, but when you do have one of the longest American films in God knows how long, with a slow moving and sort of melancholic way of telling its story, and then literally having an ending that comes out of nowhere, I don't know, man. It's a bit wacky. Now I wouldn't consider the next thing I'm about to say to be like a spoiler or anything, but I'll just mention it in case you do. This film has an epilogue, and that takes place a few decades after the rest of the film. So I think it takes place in, like, I think it's the 1980s, right, or something like that. I don't remember. And I found it to be a disappointing conclusion. It's fine. It's acted incredibly well, but it also feels like the film wants you to feel something emotionally, maybe to feel emotionally satisfied, but I sort of felt hollow when the credits started rolling. I don't know how to explain it. I wasn't a fan of the epilogue. It just felt so rushed because the film is slow, and it wants you to feel every single emotion, and the ending just rushes everything, in my opinion. It didn't have quite the payoff that I wanted or expected from the type of film this is, the type of huge film this is. I'm not sure if any of you remember, but way earlier in this video, I mentioned Guy Pearce and how his character gets like an ambiguous ending. Now I'm finally going to touch on that. There's an incredible scene that takes place towards the end of this film, towards like before the second part of the film ends and the epilogue begins, where Harrison, Pierce's character, is the central focus, and we don't get to see anything afterwards. We don't get to see how his character's story ends in this movie. Usually I'm a fan of ambiguous endings and ambiguous conclusions, but considering he was such an important and interesting character, it felt really empty to just end the film with no clear ending for him. Sort of felt like yelling, "That's it!" in the middle of the theater, but I'm not stupid, so I didn't. So The Brutalist an undeniably incredible achievement. It's a film that we talked about for decades to come, just for the sheer balls that everyone involved had to make something of this scale on a pretty minuscule budget. $10 million for a decade-spanning 4-hour period piece is so impressive. I love this. Maybe not as much as I expected or wanted to. I'm still digesting it though. It's a colossal movie.